Today is the second part of my London tour, and I'm planning to show you what I have missed in day one. This time we'll go to Greenwich and the city centre, and although the weather is typical British rain, I hope the trip will be worth getting a bit wet. Just like in part 1, the map for this walk is in the description, and of course, feel free to adjust it to your liking. Let's go! Day 2 began with a bit of hiccup on the train. Who would have thought that the driver would apologize for the malfunctioning toilet?
I would like to apologize for the lack of working toilet facilities on the front unit of this service. Hopefully my colleagues will be able to sort it out in Northampton. It's been reported already. I apologize for any inconvenience this may cause to your journey.
Nonetheless, I found myself back at Euston Station. And here's a travel tip for you. While the station does have a luggage storage facility, it's quite pricey and not all types of baggage are accepted. Storing my belongings there would have cost me an estimated of £30 or £40, and I was also uncertain whether they will accept my stuff or not. Consequently, I explored alternative options. There are companies who make arrangements with nearby small shops where you can leave your suitcases similarly to a traditional storage service, but for significantly less money. The only trade-off is that sometimes you might need to walk about 50 meters to reach these shops. But that's a choice each traveler makes on their own. Without any luggage in tow, I embarked on my exploration of London. Unfortunately, I had less luck with the weather on this second day. It was raining, which led me to use public transport more frequently, especially the Underground. For all my affection for London, the Underground system is a nightmare. To begin with, its layout is far from intuitive. Getting lost in the winding passageways is rather easy. Secondly, even once you've made it to your station, finding the right way is not straightforward at many stations. You can't merely cross from one side of the platform to the other to change direction. Sometimes you must navigate through various passages that can lead you astray. And even when you're on the correct platform, you must stay vigilant. Trains from the same platform can follow different lines. But that's not all. Even when you board a train in the correct direction on the correct line, you can still travel to the wrong place, since London Underground lines have a wonderful habit of splitting into two. Additionally, trains love halting their journey along a section of the line. You arrive at the correct station, stand on the appropriate platform, and a tube employee says, "Sorry, but the trains don't run this way at the moment, take a detour." So instead of taking a 5-minute trip to the neighboring station, you end up on a circuitous route that lasts some 40 minutes. And to make matters worse, it often means that you have to leave that station by taking yet another detour, adding another 40 minutes. In total, you'll reach the airport an hour and a half later, unless the Underground shuts down another line. In a nutshell, using the London Underground is an endeavour for the irresolute and patient souls, with an endless abundance of time to spare. Nonetheless, I had time to spare, and recalled that one line of the London Underground features these amusing driverless carriages. They mostly travel above ground, offering a delightful tour of this part of London, especially when the weather is fair.
This train is for Lewisham. The next stop is Canary Wharf. Change for London Underground, Jubilee Line and DLR to West India Quay. When leaving the train, please remember to take all your belongings with you.
However, don't be mistaken. The absence of a driver is no excuse for not paying. There's always a staff member to inspect tickets. The first point on my journey today was Greenwich, which is special as historically Britain is, to me, primarily the ruler of the seas. So day 2 in London took on a maritime theme. The British Museum and Dickens are certainly captivating, but today I'm keen on setting my sights on Cutty Sark.
What shall we do with the drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor? Early in the morning, wait it.
This clipper stands out primarily as the sole surviving composite three-masted tea clipper. These vessels were purpose-built for the speedy transportation of fresh harvest of tea from Shanghai to London. In that era, this voyage took roughly 3 or 4 months. These races, which occurred annually from 1859 to 1872, even spawned a betting system in England, with wagering volumes nearly rivaling those of horse races. In its prime, up to 17 clippers participated in these races, though by the end, only 8 remained. It's worth noting that Cutty Sark never claimed victory in the tea race. Nevertheless, all other ships of this class faded into obscurity. Thermopylae was ceremoniously scuttled, Ariel disappeared, Taiping was lost in the South China Sea, Taitsing vanished in the Indian Ocean near Zanzibar, Sir Lancelot met its fate in the Bay of Bengal. Cutty Sark, on the other hand, changed hands multiple times, serving as a coal transport and training ship at one point before returning to England as a museum. The most famous chapter in Cutty Sark history unfolded during the final tea race of 1872, when Cutty Sark, leading the race, lost its rudder in a Pacific Ocean storm. The ship's owner's brother, aboard the vessel, suggested putting in at Cape Town for repairs, but the crew fashioned a new rudder on the high seas in just 6 days, arriving in London a week after the race winner, the clipper Thermopylae. The history of tea clippers represents the swan song of the sailing fleet. In the latter half of the 19th century, steamships began to emerge. But like any novel product, they didn't instantly dominate. Moreover, for long-distance routes they required coal refueling, so sailing clippers continued to serve for the swift transport of urgent cargo over lengthy distances. Tea trading companies commissioned ships like these, laden with sails and capable of harnessing minimal wind for propulsion. As per accounts, the legendary clipper Thermopylae could sail at a speed of 7 knots, it's approximately 13 km per hour, even allowing one to walk on its deck with a lit candle. After the conclusion of the tea races, clipper ships continued to transport wool from Australia through the Roaring Forties and Cape Horn. In this capacity, Cutty Sark frequently vied with Thermopylae. However, these clippers transported more than just tea and wool. To be candid, there was also the concept of opium clippers. Well, you get the idea. Cutty Sark boasts a composite hull, meaning it features a metal framework with frames, beams and stringers made of metal, but its skin consists of wood from 2 different types of timber. The clipper measures over 85 meters in length, has a maximum width of almost 11 meters and a draft of only 6.5 meters, yet it carries almost 3,000 square meters of sails. It's no surprise that Cutty Sark could traverse from Australia to England laden with wool in a mere 2.5 months. The clipper's name originates from a witch. In Scots, Cutty Sark means short skirt. This is the attire worn by the Scottish witch Nanny Dee, whose figure adorns the clipper's bow. The young witch also grasps a horse tail in her hand, as per the legend recounted by Robert Burns in the poem Tam O'Shanter, where she was chasing a drunken farmer who was saved by his horse, which the witch couldn't catch and could only tear off its tail. Today, the clipper functions as a museum. Admission tickets cost 18 quid for adults and I believe 9 for children. Various interactive programs are often hosted there, and if you're not afraid of climbing more than 40 meters, you can even climb the mast or immerse yourself in the era of sailing. I might be somewhat biased, but for me, genuine relics of the past like this offer an invaluable opportunity to touch firsthand something that I could only read about in books during my childhood. Racing it could be even more thrilling, though I personally favor smaller vessels. another remarkable location in Greenwich. If you've ever encountered coordinates or world time references, you've certainly come across mentions of the prime meridian or Greenwich Mean Time. This is all historically grounded, of course. As the reigning maritime power, Britain actively advanced navigation and was able to establish its own standards in an era where there were no universally accepted conventions. Consequently, the origin of coordinates was set at the point that the British deemed London, specifically the Greenwich Observatory. Simultaneously, to avoid doubling the efforts, standard time was also tied to the time measured by the same observatory in Greenwich. I'm now heading up to this observatory to show you where all the calculations originate. The Brits also introduced their system of measurements. Yards, inches, pounds and dozens. Nonetheless, on a global scale, they couldn't withstand the competition from the metric system, although they're still widely used in Britain, Commonwealth nations and the US. Adjacent to the observatory building, there's a monument to General Wolfe. I don't delve into him separately. He's a typical British general who actively fought, for instance, in Canada and met his end there. Frankly, I'm still uncertain why his monument was erected here, near the observatory. Here it is, the Greenwich Observatory. Guided tours are available and individually the cost is the same as for Cutty Sark. However, you can acquire a combined ticket for both, priced at 27 quid for adults and half of that, 13.50 for children. Many people are unaware that you can view the prime meridian without entering the observatory. There's a small gate near the wall facing the ascent to the observatory, and a bit farther you'll find the very line dividing the western hemisphere from the eastern. The wall isn't perpendicular to the meridian, so its continuation is at an angle. I was initially under the impression that the white line traversing the park lawn precisely marked the extension of the hemisphere dividing line. But I was mistaken. I'm standing on the actual line at the observatory, and from here it's evident that the line on the ground doesn't represent its continuation. Overall, the town of Greenwich is a delightful place for a leisurely stroll. Unfortunately, I'm pressed for time and the weather doesn't encourage a leisurely walk. Upon reaching the underground, I encountered a situation that aligns with what I mentioned earlier. The station entrance was closed. Thankfully, the adjacent entrance was open, complete with a sign meticulously detailing the number of steps to the platform. Don't worry though, there's an elevator available as well. After a brief ride, it's more convenient to get here from Piccadilly Circus Station, which I discussed in the first video. I find myself at the theatre, which has recently undergone a name change. Nestled on Haymarket Street stands one of the finest musical theatres in the West End, Her Majesty's Theatre. They haven't updated the sign yet. Following the passing of Elizabeth II, it's now His Majesty's Theatre. In addition to hosting operas by Mozart and Verdi, this is where the iconic The Phantom of the Opera premiered in 1986. Now, carrying on with the maritime theme from the second day, let's venture down to Trafalgar Square. Whitehall Street culminates here, and at the square centre, classic British lines, installed a quarter century after the column itself, stand guard over Nelson's column, a tribute to one of the legends of the British Navy. He is renowned for his personal bravery and combat prowess, as well as his stern approach to subordinates and king, his support for slavery, cruelty to prisoners, and the legendary affair with a married woman. You probably know that in Corsica, Nelson suffered an eye injury and had limited vision with it. Moreover, he lost an arm during the battle in Tenerife. So I've always wondered whether one side of him was affected or it was somehow diagonal. It turns out it was just one side, the right eye and the right hand. Nonetheless, this didn't seem to trouble Lady Hamilton. The bas-reliefs at the base of the column, cast from captured French cannons, depict Nelson's famous victories, including his final one at the Battle of Trafalgar. These bas-reliefs depict the famous signal hoisted on Nelson's flagship before the battle. England expects every man will do his duty. On both sides of the column, you'll find monuments to the commanders of the English colonial forces in India, Charles Napier and Henry Havelock. While their names might not resonate widely today, Havelock, for instance, led the quelling of the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857-59. Not ringing any bells? Well, then recall where Jules Verne's Captain Nemo hailed from. By the way, did you know that according to the original concept, Nemo was meant to be a Pole who fought against Russia, but the publisher dissuaded the author from this idea. Here along the road lies another little-known gem in London, yet it exudes an incredibly cozy and atmospheric charm. This is Goodwin's Court. It's a short stretch measuring just 85 meters between St. Martin and Bedfordbury streets. This area retains the character of London from the 17th and 18th centuries. The houses here are original, dating back to the 1690s. Many of them were once shops, and even today it's easy to envision these places illuminated by gas lamps and narrow lane in a bustling part of London during that era. While the lane may not boast particularly remarkable structures, the ambience has been impeccably preserved. Now, since we've embarked on discussing atmosphere, and in the previous video I mentioned Harry Potter, here's another reason for fans of Rowling's books to visit. Some suggest that Goodwin's Court served as the prototype for Diagon Alley, a place where every self-respecting wizard can procure their essentials. Next, I continued towards the city center, and en route I encountered the delightful Rose Street, adorned with uniquely colorful parking bollards. My ultimate destination was the Royal Opera House, although it's commonly known as Covent Garden. To be precise, this is the third edifice occupying this site. The initial one was constructed in the early 18th century, but tragically succumbed to a fire in the early 19th century. To recoup the restoration costs once the theatre reopened, the management raised ticket prices. However, this decision irked the audience, leading to noisy protests and disruptions during performances. After a few months, the management yielded, reinstating the prior ticket prices. Nonetheless, this didn't rescue the theatre, as it endured the second fire in the mid-19th century. It was of course reconstructed again and continued to function as a theatre until the outbreak of World War I, when it was converted into a warehouse. During World War II, such heresy ceased, and the theatre served as a dance floor. After the war, the theatre re-emerged, with the first production being Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty. Remarkably, it's still featured on the bill to this day. Behind Covent Garden, there's a small courtyard where, in fair weather, one can likely enjoy a pleasant seat. However, I couldn't afford such luxury. I simply sought shelter from the weather. Nearby, I stumbled upon this sign. It's not just endearing and thoughtful in itself, but I was also struck by the title of the Toilet of the Year. Continuing our theatrical theme and exploration of West End theatres, here's another esteemed venue for musical aficionados and fans of ABBA's legacy, the Novello Theater. Meanwhile, I proceed onward to historical landmarks. Along the way is the Indian House in Great Britain, and across from it, individuals offended by India are protesting from within a tent. A bit further down, a grand edifice now houses King's College. On the whole, I can't say that this part of London exudes coziness. Not at all. It is rather imposing, somewhat overwhelming, highly official, so I aimed to depart it swiftly. To the left, you'll spot the Church of St. Clement. It's noteworthy for two reasons. Firstly, it was designed by Sir Christopher Wren, and secondly, it serves as the home church of the Royal Air Force. The initial church on this site was constructed by Danes married to English women in the 9th century. And even then it was dedicated to St. Clement, considered the patron saint of sailors at the time. In the 11th century, William the Conqueror reconstructed the church, and it endured until the 17th century. While the Great Fire of 1666 spared the church, it was already dilapidated at the time, and the decision was made to rebuild it. It was Christopher Wren who undertook this task, and the reconstruction concluded by 1680. In 1941, the church was nearly obliterated by a direct hit from a German incendiary bomb. All that remained were the walls. The church I saw in Birmingham fared much better. It was only in 1958 when St. Clement's Church was restored. Mind you, the church stands right on the border. This is no longer London, but the city of Westminster. The dull building on the left are the Royal Courts of Justice. Nothing particularly remarkable, really. I'm not especially drawn to acquaint myself with this part of London. While the buildings possess a certain beauty, there's not much to describe, rather emblematic of the British Empire. A bit further on, there's a monument marking the ancient border of the City of London. This boundary is delineated by 14 dragons or griffins scattered throughout the city, several of which are original and trace back to the 17th century. The walls define the limits of the City of London, yet the laws of London extended to gates outside these walls. One of such outpost gates rested right here. This is the renowned Temple Bar. I'll explain the reference to the temple shortly, but for now I'll mention that it was a principal entry point to the city, as it was through here that monarchs traversed between their two residences, the Tower and the Palace of Westminster. Moreover, this was the route they took from the Palace of Westminster to services in St. Paul's Cathedral. There even existed a tradition where once a year the English monarch, travelling from Westminster to London, paused at this point, awaiting for the Lord Mayor of London to present a sword, as an act symbolizing submission to the King's authority. This point marks the juncture where the Strand, originating from Westminster, transitions into London's Fleet Street. The first outpost here materialized around the 13th century and was probably just a chain or a barrier. In 1265, following an uprising where Londoners backed the Earl of Montfort and suffered defeat, Prince Edward commanded the removal of all chains and barriers leading into the city, relocating them to the Tower. By the mid-14th century, a wooden gate stood at this location, even housing a small prison within. The gate underwent numerous renovations, and though it, like the adjacent church of St. Clement, remained unscathed during the Great Fire, its state had deteriorated by that time. Thus, much like the reconstruction of the church, Christopher Wren proposed the reconstruction of the gate. The stone gate stood here until 1878, when it was dismantled. 2 years later, Sir Henry More purchased the stones and restored the gate near his estate in Hertfordshire. The gates were relocated once again in 2003, this time purchased by the City Hall of London and moved to St. Paul's Cathedral, where they presently stand. Next to this spot sat one of the oldest pubs in London, the Devil and the Saint. Its existence dates back to the 16th century, but towards the end of the 18th century, the burgeoning bank next door acquired the building, expanding into this location. Now, as I stroll through the serene and surprisingly deserted courtyards, I can finally elaborate on why this area is known as the Temple. Presently, the entire area is occupied by lawyers and legal officers, but some 700 or 800 years ago, a vastly different populace roamed these streets. During that era, it was the estate of the Knights Templar, who in the 12th century wielded considerable influence. Kings had negotiations here, knights' representatives held seats in the parliament, and their temple served as a treasury on numerous occasions. The Knights erected a church in homage to the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, which was consecrated in 1185 by the then Patriarch of Jerusalem, Heraclius. The oldest section of the church is circular, a customary feature of Templar order churches, and the rectangular extension was appended about 50 years later. For over 100 years, this entire vicinity served as a religious focal point in London. Papal delegates and even English monarchs resided here, although I'm not quite certain why the latter did so, given their proximity to their own residences. In 1312, the Order of the Templars was disbanded, and the Pope transferred the temple to the Order of the Hospitaliers, who maintained ownership until the mid-16th century, when their order was also destroyed and the temple became royal property. Much like the neighboring structures, the temple survived the Great Fire unscathed. However, its condition warranted reconstruction, and of course, Christopher Wren undertook this task. The temple suffered again in February 1941 from a German incendiary bomb. The organ, roof, and nearly all the wooden structures were consumed by flames. But remarkably, during the restoration, some original elements used by Wren were discovered in storage and were reintegrated into the structure in the 20th century. As I ventured back into Fleet Street from the courtyard, I stumbled upon these enchanting lamps that still retain their controls from the days when they were fueled by gas. Nowadays they have energy-efficient light bulbs, yet they look so lovely and cozy. I then took a right turn along Fleet Street, ultimately reaching another one of London's principal attractions. Despite its immense size, there are few points from which you can behold it in its entirety, as it's always concealed by neighboring buildings. This, of course, is none other than St. Paul's Cathedral. A church of some sort has graced this location since time immemorial, dating back to the 7th and 8th centuries, but precise depictions of those early structures have not survived. The site was chosen for an obvious reason. It stands as the highest point in London. Consequently, the church undergoing restoration after the catastrophic fire of 1087 marked already the 4th iteration on this site. At that time, it was one of the lengthiest churches globally, boasting one of the loftiest spires, and according to contemporary accounts, it featured some extraordinarily exquisite stained glass windows. For a medieval city, it constituted an incredibly impressive creation. In those days, fires were the bane of the cities. It should come as no surprise that this church too fell victim to the scourge of flames. Struck by lightning in 1561, the spire was reduced to ashes and was never reconstructed, despite the church continuing to serve its religious purpose, even as the building deteriorated over the years. Legend has it that in the early 17th century, Oliver Cromwell contemplated ceding the crumbling church to a Jewish community for conversion into a synagogue. In the ensuing years, the facades underwent reconstruction. By 1630, the eastern facade adopted a more classical aesthetic. However, come to the mid-17th century, it became evident that the entire structure had become antiquated, and proposals emerged for its rejuvenation. The architect, appointed by Charles II, had commenced Devonshire reconstruction plans when another stroke of fortune occurred, a momentous event known as the Great Fire of 1666. The conflagration inflicted damage upon the building, and although restoration was plausible, the architect advocated the complete demolition of the church, followed by a full reconstruction. This architect, as you've probably guessed, was Sir Christopher Wren. He presented a concept to expand the cathedral and slightly rotate the new church. The old cathedral was razed and construction commenced on a new one. However, it was deemed that the design appeared overly simplistic, leading to its rejection by church authorities in 1673. Next year, in 1674, Wren offered an alternative design, which garnered approval from all quarters, including the king. Nonetheless, the final iteration of the cathedral diverged from this design as well. The completed cathedral exhibits this appearance. It wasn't until 1711 that Parliament officially recognized the construction's completion. Reaction to the cathedral spanned the spectrum from awe to accusations that it lacked English character and resembled St. Peter's Cathedral. A sentiment I tend to agree with. It does indeed bear a striking resemblance. Ironically, St. Paul's Cathedral is challenging to view in its entirety. It's almost as if the neighboring structures were shifted aside to accommodate it, and no one ever considered designing a viewpoint. Contrast this with St. Peter's Cathedral, visible in all its grandeur from the square in front of it. There is one viewpoint in front of St. Paul's Cathedral, but only the western facade is observable. A little secret: the best place to catch sight of the cathedral is on the opposite side of the Thames. There is a cafe on the upper floors of the Tate Modern Gallery. The prices there may not be the most budget-friendly, but they should suffice for a cup of coffee, especially since the entry to the gallery is free. From this cafe, which overlooks the Thames, you can enjoy the most exquisite views of the Millennium Bridge and St. Paul's Cathedral. Regrettably, I had never ventured inside the cathedral before and decided to fix it this time. Alas, I soon discovered that the photography inside is prohibited. Therefore, I'll recount the experience, but the visuals will be someone else's. To be honest, these colossal cathedrals all share a certain resemblance. It's not that they fail to impress, but I've already encountered similar grandeur many times. Personally, I'm more drawn to smaller and inviting structures, as the vast scale can feel somewhat oppressive. Still, the cathedral exudes a monumental and awe-inspiring ambience. Surprisingly, in photographs, the sense of grandeur is even more pronounced than in person. But regardless, it's undoubtedly worth a visit. You can also ascend the colonnade, but as is my habit, I refrain from going up. In reality, St. Paul's serves as a military pantheon, adorned with memorial flags and inscriptions on its walls, each bearing the names of those who perished and recounting the circumstances of their demise. Underneath the cathedral is a crypt, which houses a rather modest grave of Sir Christopher Wren. The plaque reads, "Reader, if you seek his monument, look around you." The crypt also hosts the tomb of Admiral Nelson, whose monument I previously showed in Trafalgar Square. Curiously, Nelson rests in another individual's sarcophagus. Not that he purloined it, but initially the sarcophagus has been designated for Cardinal Wolsey, but it later caught the eye of Henry VIII, who intended to employ it for his own tomb, which he finally didn't. Anyway, after remaining idle for 2 centuries, it ultimately became the final resting place for Horatio Nelson. The crypt is also the final resting place of the Duke of Wellington, whom I mentioned earlier when discussing the arch at Hyde Park. The burial site of Alexander Fleming, the discoverer of penicillin, is also here, and it maintains a far more understated appearance. It's a touch ironic that he is the rare one among the commemorated individuals who saved lives rather than claimed them. I think this is very unfair. Outside, the rain has subsided, allowing me to take a stroll around the cathedral. This is how it looks from the Millennium Bridge, and on the opposite side of the Thames is the very same Tate Gallery with the cafe I mentioned just minutes ago. Now it's time for me to board the Underground once more, heading towards the final destination today. A location that truly encapsulates the essence of London, yet it appears a bit too standard for my taste. The Tower of London. There's a certain conundrum here. This episode would be incomplete without a visit to the tower. However, presenting a comprehensive tour as part of this short video seems somewhat absurd. So let's opt for a leisurely perambulation instead. For those needing more, a proper guided tour is highly recommended. In addition, virtually anyone with even a modest familiarity with the English language has heard something about the tower. The Raven tradition, beefeaters, derived from beef and eat, a reference to the times when Londoners were starving and the guards received beef rations. The executions of monarchs, including Henry VI and Anne Boleyn. All in all, it's not the cheeriest of places. Yet, over its 1,000-year history, the tower has served many roles. Some overlapped, such as a fortified fortress, a royal residence, an armory, burial ground, a mint, a prison and execution site, a treasury, and even at some point a zoo. According to legend, the tower was considered the most impregnable fortress of its era, owing to its stout walls and broad moat, the greener one visible in the foreground. But I suppose such claims are made about all fortresses. Otherwise it would seem rather ill-conceived, like, "Your Majesty, we constructed a fortress for you here, but it's so rubbish." Besides, I don't recall that anyone seriously attempted to besiege the tower. In contrast, consider Istanbul, which certainly withstood numerous sieges. I even dedicated a separate episode to it. But did anyone ever genuinely lay siege to the tower? The tower only has two entrances. The first is via land, here from the middle tower across the moat to Byward Tower, and the second, known as the Traitor's Gate, provides a waterway entrance. This second entrance was established approximately 200 years after the construction of the initial structure, the White Tower, in the 13th century by Edward I. At that time, the tower served as a royal residence, and the king sought direct access to it via the water. The moniker Traitor's Gate first emerged in the 16th century, courtesy of the Flemish artist Anton van der Wingerde, who bestowed the title upon the gate. It's a pity I hadn't encountered his works earlier. It turns out that he left images of Alcalá de Henares with the city walls I previously featured in a separate episode, along with Madrid, though Madrid is pretty hard to recognize. While some prisoners did indeed enter the tower through the Traitor's Gate, it's important not to misconstrue this as the exclusive point of entry. Anne Boleyn, for example, contrary to popular belief, arrived to the tower by land. However, speaking of the waterway, it's impossible to omit another iconic symbol of London, the Tower Bridge. It's imperative not to confuse it with London Bridge, situated slightly upstream, where in medieval times the heads of those executed at the tower were impaled on pikes, a rather conventional medieval pastime. Furthermore, this isn't the same bridge from the 19th century. The medieval London Bridge was reconstructed at the outset of the 19th century, and this bridge in turn was replaced by the one we now observe in 1967. You'd never guess where the previous bridge went. It was sold to the United States. The story behind this sale is the stuff of yet another urban legend which claims that the Americans inadvertently bought the wrong bridge. In truth, like most legends, this one doesn't stand up to scrutiny. The Americans got precisely what they wanted. But let's return to Tower Bridge. Despite the way it looks, it's relatively modern, only dating back to the late 19th century. And its lower section, accommodating all traffic, can be separated and raised to allow the passage of ships. There's no fixed schedule for raising the bridge. It's operated on demand in real time. When a ship approaches, traffic comes to a halt, the two sections of the bridge are raised, the vessel passes through, and then the bridge is lowered and traffic resumes. The mechanism for lifting the bridge is concealed within the base of the towers. Originally, it was powered by steam and hydraulics, but since 1972, electric motors have replaced the steam engine. Regrettably, my time in London is drawing to a close. On this occasion, I wasn't able to see as much as I had hoped. The Tate Modern Gallery, a replica of Francis Drake's Golden Hind, the captivating district of Camden, and possibly the Globe Theater remain on my wish list. Nonetheless, my personal response to the usual question, is it worth visiting London, is an unequivocal yes. Though careful planning is essential to ensure you have ample time to explore your areas of interest. A touch of good weather wouldn't hurt either, unless you're ready to experience some typical English rain. And that's it for today's London trip. Thank you for joining me, and see you in the next video.